Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Kobe ink number 57. I'm not sure how to pronounce this one, but I think it's translated hydrangea purple. I'll be doing a writing sample with this ink on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll compare Kobe number 57 to similar inks from my collection. I'll take a look at some writing samples that I did on other types of paper. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. I enjoyed writing with this ink using my glass dip nib. The ink came off the nib nice and uniformly, and it just felt pleasant to write with. The swatch that I made with tweezers is nice and crisp, and there's a hint of shading visible. The drip at the end of the swatch has a little border or halo of purple with pink in the middle, and you see hints of that just a little bit in the writing. I'm going to begin my writing samples with a Pilot Kakuno. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. With this being a fairly light chromo shading ink, I didn't have high expectations for this extra fine nib, but I'm pleasantly surprised by how enjoyable it is to write with. Sometimes with inks like this, it can be usable if I write with a light hand, but the good thing about this ink is I just write with my normal grip and normal amount of pressure, and it's very pleasant. In fact, I would classify this as, oh yeah, definitely, this is smooth. Next, I've got a Pilot Pereira. It has a stainless steel fine nib. This is also nice and smooth, but you can see I had a bit of a hard start here. I will chalk that up to this pen just being dipped in the ink. I don't have a converter attached to it or a ink cartridge, but this nib doesn't usually hard start. In fact, I've never had any issues with it hard starting, but it is writing drier. And so since it's not attached to a converter, I'm guessing that's why it had that hard start. It felt drier, and you can kind of see it in the text here. It's a little bit lighter even than the extra fine nib, but I don't think you would have any issues if you had a converter attached. But this particular nib is a bit drier, but it is still smooth. Next, I've got a Pilot Explorer. It also has a stainless steel fine nib. I've got 3 of these Pilot Explorers, and I bought them all fairly recently. 2 of them have medium nibs, and this one has a fine nib. I wanted to test this ink in a medium nib because I thought that would be give it the best chance of performing well, but it performs really well in this fine nib. And you can see that this fine nib is a bit broader than this fine nib. Part of that is this is just a bit wetter. I think this nib is a little bit drier than normal. There is slight variation between nibs, these stainless steel nibs. Most of them write pretty consistently, but occasionally you will get one that writes a bit drier. I've got a Pilot 78G, or I think it's the one that I gave to my sister that wrote noticeably drier than the others. It still performed well, and it writing drier made it work well with wetter inks. It was still nicely tuned, but it was just slightly drier than the average Pilot steel nib. So, with this ink performing this well in a fine nib, I'm sure it would be great in a steel medium nib. And this is just also very smooth. Next, I've got a Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat gold medium nib, and it is marked hard medium. Now, it might be hard to see because on my ink smear, this light colored ink just really wipes, a lot of it wipes away and it's very pale, but the initial X is more pink, and then this ink over here that wipes away is a bit blue. With these chromo shading inks, you see this a lot of time. One component of the ink will soak into the paper a bit faster, and then another component will be the part that wipes away. I always think that's so interesting. But this Sailor Medium nib is very pleasant. It puts down a bit more ink than the steel nibs, or at least the Pilot steel nibs. And so, like I mentioned up here with the ink splot having that halo of the more of a blue component of the purple, you kind of see that just a little bit. It may be even not enough to even notice it or see it with the naked eye, but it just gives your writing some character. You can tell that it's not as flat as just a monochrome ink. And this is not, it's not as smooth as these Pilot nibs, but it is, well, it's a different kind of smoothness. It's a chalky smoothness. Very pleasant. I really like this. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This Platinum medium nib feels very similar to the Sailor medium nib. They both have that chalky kind of feedback to them, and I find it very pleasant. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This nib is a bit wetter than the Sailor and the Platinum, and it feels more slippery smooth. And you saw that little skip there. I've noticed this on other papers. I've never noticed this nib having baby's bottom before, but maybe it does have just the tiniest bit of baby's bottom. And with this ink, maybe I'm writing with a lighter hand with this ink, because I've noticed it skip in a few places on other writing samples. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. And you can see the smear from this nib is pretty dry. It's drier than the Explorer Fine nib, and it feels dry. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel broad nib. It feels nice and smooth on this paper. Now, it had an interesting feeling on some of the other writing samples, and I'll talk about that later. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. This nib just felt glassy smooth. While this dries, I'll take a look at some other writing samples. The writing sample that I did on Rhodia paper, everything just felt very pleasant. Well, I'll say everything except for the Pilot Metropolitan with the calligraphy medium nib. That calligraphy medium just spreads the ink out a little bit too far, and it looks pale, and it just feels a little dry. The two broader nibs, the broad and the stub nib, felt nice and velvety, not glassy smooth, just the slightest bit of resistance that keeps it from feeling slippery smooth. To me, that's just perfect. The Custom Heritage was slippery smooth, but I wouldn't call it unpleasant, but I did have just a few little places where, like right here, the parenthesis skipped, but overall, it looks pretty nice. My favorite pens were the Sailor and the Platinum. Those medium nibs with just a little bit of chalky feedback. Very, very enjoyable to write with. This is where I discovered that I wasn't writing with a medium. I was writing with a fine, in fact, and also surprisingly smooth and very legible, and just looks really nice. And like I mentioned before, the Kakuno, I just wrote like normal. I didn't have to use any effort to write with a lighter hand than normal, and it just felt very nice. My writing sample that I did on copy paper, everything felt really nice. The Metropolitan looked a little bit drier than the others, but it was just like with the Lucina, it was smooth with a little bit of feedback. Now, one thing I do want to mention, actually, on the Metropolitan and the Lucina, they weren't unpleasant. It was a weird sensation. They both felt pretty smooth, but I could feel the nib slit. That gave both of those nibs just a little bit of feedback. It wasn't enough that it was unpleasant, but it was smooth and feedbacky at the same time. And I just found that unusual. Now, all of these nibs felt pretty nice. Even the Sailor that felt a little dry, that was just in comparison to the others. It wasn't unpleasant, but you can see that the ink did spread a bit. But I don't know, something about this color of ink, it kind of, the ink spread doesn't show up or look unattractive unless you get, really close to it. So not a bad ink to use on copy paper. I would say this ink would be a good choice for left-handed writers. It seems to soak into the paper really quickly, and, it dries instantly, but that does cause it to soak through the paper in the medium and larger nib sizes. Now, I have to apologize here. Kobe number 57 doesn't appear to be available here in the U.S. at most retailers. You might be able to get some on the secondhand market or at pen shows, but I went ahead and did this ink test because I wanted to see how a chromo shader like this would perform in the pens that I tested, and this one seemed to perform pretty well. And when I referred back to my notes of previous chromo shading or similar inks to this, Murasaki Shikibu, I wouldn't consider it a chromo shader, but it is similar to this ink, and it performs well in most nibs like number 57 did. Now, when I referred back to my notes on Sailor Fuji Sugata, the results weren't quite as good. In the finer nibs, it did feel kind of dry. And so did Neko Yanagi. Now, Neko Yanagi is a bit more blue. It looks like it possibly behaves a bit more different the way the shading does up here in the swatch. Neko Yanagi I didn't consider it a pleasant ink to use in fine nibs. I guess the best substitute for this out of the inks that I have is Iroshizuku Murasaki Shikibu, but it's not a chromo shader. I did writing samples with each of the pens on a little piece of rhodia and submerged it in water for 10 minutes. And you can see there's no water resistance, but that pink component that I mentioned earlier that seems to soak into the paper quicker does stick around a little bit, but not quite enough to be legible in most nib sizes. Okay, no bleed through. The ink doesn't even try to bleed through on the heaviest parts of the swatch. There's no sheen and very little shading, but like I mentioned earlier, that little hint of halo that you see in the wetter nibs just really gives this ink some interesting character. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.